If you want to know what the terms continuous integration, continuous deployment, and continuous delivery mean, and why they're so important in software development, keep watching. So essentially everybody who has to do with software heard about continuous integration, deployment, and delivery. Those terms are somehow defined and people throw around those terms quite a lot. But today we're going to look at what they actually mean, and we'll give a quick overview why they are important and why you need to know about them if you want to be a successful engineer. Quick interstitial before we start. On successintech.com I offer coaching packages and mock interviews to achieve more in your career and find and land your dream job. So if you're interested in that, go to successintech.com, and now let's get into the topic of the day. So what you need to know beforehand is that some of those terms depend on the others. So let's start with continuous integration. Continuous integration means that code is developed and then pushed to a shared code base, something like a master branch or a mainline branch, multiple times a day, or at least on a very regular basis. So instead of having repositories on your own per developer, and you keep those until a bigger release happens, you and every other developer in that team will push code frequently to a shared branch. Now, what you need to know about continuous integration and the other two terms, it's not only about writing and pushing it to a shared branch, it's also about having multiple steps involved, from writing code to deploying it to a runtime or to a server or to somewhere where the code actually serves a purpose. So let's look at the next one, which is continuous delivery. Now, continuous delivery is you are able to push the code to a shared branch and then it enters the pipeline. So the pipeline is a loosely defined term of multiple steps which your code runs through until it ends in a deployment step somewhere. So in order to have continuous delivery, you need to be able to write code, push it somewhere, where the code then gets picked up automatically and runs through this pipeline, where the pipeline manages the code in that time frame, so to say, and then it ends up being deployed somewhere. That enables you to write code and deploy it a lot of times and on a regular basis, and with with not a lot of manual involvement. But continuous delivery does not dictate how often you actually deploy code to production. Okay, so the last one is continuous deployment. Now, continuous deployment relies on having the ability to continuously deliver. That means continuous deployment relies on having this pipeline of automated steps ending in a deployment. The difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment is that with delivery, you have the ability to push code to a mainline branch, and then it automatically gets pushed into production. With continuous deployment, every change which actually lands in this mainline branch is pushed to production. So in delivery, you have the ability, but you may choose not to push every one of those changes to prod. In continuous deployment, every change that lands in the mainline branch will also be deployed automatically in prod. Now let's look into a little bit more detail what happens in the deployment pipeline. So you're a developer, you write code, and at some point you commit it. You'll run some local tests, but those are probably not that big of a test suite. So you run your local tests, you commit it into a version control system, and it will probably go into a code review state. Now, the code review itself can be part of the deployment pipeline, but it could also be before going into the deployment pipeline. Now, when the code review is positive, your change will probably get merged into this mainline branch we talked about. From there, it's, so to say, in the deployment pipeline, because it will be picked up automatically by a build server, for example. So the build server will take the code and compile it and build it with all its dependencies. And then every pipeline looks different. So from there on, you can have many different test and validation steps. So you can have unit tests, you can have integration tests on all kinds of levels. You can even have load testing there, or some kind of end-to-end testing. And if that's all positive, there could also be a manual validation step or a manual approval step. And at the end of the pipeline is the big deployment step. And this deployment step can be either totally simple, so it's just being pushed on one fixed host, or it can be extremely complex. Because if you have big systems, big maybe web services, those code changes you deploy, they depend on many different systems, and many different systems depend on your service, right? So the deployment step is then actually a pretty complex thing, because it needs to be deployed automatically on many different hosts, on maybe virtualized environments, and you can't just SSH into that host or onto that host and replace a jar file, for example. So this automated step needs to be very well orchestrated, and some of the hosts will get taken down. The new version is uploaded there, while the old version still runs on other hosts, and then gradually you replace all the hosts or all the environments with this new version, which all of this could happen multiple times a day. Now, what are the implications of having continuous delivery or continuous deployment? So obviously, having an automated system set up which tests and deploys your code will result in more releases. So if you have continuous deployment set up, it's not uncommon that companies or teams deploy code to production multiple times a day. And that's also what it's there for, because it follows this very agile principle that you iterate often and many times, instead of having big monolithic blocks of a release, which are oftentimes hard to push to production. So instead of having big releases with big features and big changes, you have many smaller changes, which depend and rely heavily on this good automation. So if your pipeline is not well automated, continuous deployment is almost impossible. So let's talk about a couple of advantages and disadvantages of CI or CD. I won't be able to give you the full picture of pros and cons, because it's a very extensive topic, but we can talk about the obvious ones. So obviously, visibility and getting feedback for your code and for your changes is simpler and easier, because it's possible for every member of the team to see where your code change at the moment is, what the status of it is. So if you want to know what happened in production 10 minutes ago, you can look at the pipeline and you see the exact state the pipeline is in, which change was deployed last, and how it went through the testing and validation steps, what the log outputs were. And also earlier, talking about reviews, the whole team can look at the reviews, can look at maybe the validation steps, style, code style validations, things like that. Other than that, of course, automated deployment means easier deployment, because you don't have to SSH onto machines and take them down manually, set them up again. You don't have to run the tests yourself, and so on and so forth. Everything is automated, which brings us to the biggest disadvantage probably. Setting up a good automated pipeline is a really hard problem in most cases, because if the project is really small, and from the start on that the project is maybe just a couple of weeks, you probably won't set up a big automated pipeline, because there is maybe just one iteration. But if the projects get bigger, it's just hard to set up a good automated pipeline. Now, that is the reason why there exists a couple of good and stable open source solutions to build servers and continuous integration. Many companies chose to do it themselves. That means you either have a very uniform build process, or your continuous deployment and your deployment pipeline grows to a very, very mighty tool, because your deployments could have very different shapes, different languages, different setups, different storage solutions, and so on and so forth. So building that pipeline is hard and can take a lot of time. Okay, that's it for today. Don't forget to visit successintech.com for coaching and mock interviews. Also, if you have any questions about this topic, leave them in the comment section below and I'll try to answer all of them. My name is Ramon Lopez and this is Success in Tech.